What's up, everybody? This is Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner, and today I'm going to be reviewing the Focal Twin6 BE studio monitors. This is a 2.5-way studio monitor. It can be laid on its side like it is right now, or it can be stood up. The recommendation is to listen to this speaker at 1 to 3 meters listening distance because it is a near-field monitor, and that's actually how I treated it in my testing, my subjective analysis, and then the objective data is always taken at 2 meters, so it is still within that sweet spot of their recommendation. And with that said, let's go ahead and get into this. Let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. Subjectively, what did I think about this speaker? Bottom line up front. Bottom line up front is this has an impeccable mid-bass and impeccable mid-range. And then the high frequencies is where I started to have issues with this speaker. But below maybe about 2K or so, I thought this speaker was just purely fantastic. I'm going to kick things off first with the data. So if you don't care about data, which you probably shouldn't be at this channel if you don't care about data, but if you don't care about this data, check the timestamps below. You can skip to the subjective portion, which I'll get to shortly. But for now, we're going to go ahead and kick things off with the objective portion of the data. We are at my website, which is aaronsaudiocorner.com, and I am looking at the studio monitor review here. This is just a stock photo because I couldn't manage to take a good photo of it myself for the life of me, so I don't know. And then here I have some of the standard information from the Focal website, which I just pulled from them directly. And interestingly enough, they actually call this speaker a 3-way speaker, and I'm not really sure why they do that other than they just don't want to confuse people, but it actually is a 2.5-way monitor speaker. And why is it a 2.5-way instead of a 3-way? Well, it's 2.5-way because both of these woofers play overlapping bands to about 150 hertz, and then from 150 hertz and up, just the inner side, and it depends on how you flip the little toggle switch on the back, which I'll show you down here. Let's see here, this little toggle switch right there. So when you flip that toggle switch, that makes the positioning for the speaker mid-range to be toward the inner side. So if you're going to set it up on the right, like this speaker is currently set up for the right toggle switch, that means that the left mid-range, yeah, your left, am I right? It's so hard turning around. The left mid-range is actually the mid-range unit, and then the right side is the mid-bass unit, which plays from 40 to 150 per their spec. So let's go back up here and see where they're saying that. 40 hertz to 150 hertz. And then it's got the beryllium dome tweeter in there, which everybody, that knows at least about Focal knows about the beryllium dome tweeter. And I don't know if I know anybody that doesn't like it. I know a few people that said it's a little bit bright, but I don't really know what they mean when they say that in particular. But in general, I'd say most everybody I run across with likes the Focal tweeter, the beryllium tweeter at least. The price on this speaker is $2,200 USD per speaker. These are not cheap. And honestly, when I first got them in and I realized the price, I was thinking to myself, there's no way that these are going to be worth the price. And I still have a hard time justifying to other people, what they should spend. Yeah, this is a good speaker, but you have a limited budget, so how much should you spend? So I'm not really one to say that this is or isn't a good speaker for $2,200, but I will go ahead and tell you that I really think this is a great speaker in the mid-bass and mid-range, and it's certainly one that you should put on your list. So let's keep going down the list here. Here's some specifications, and you can see that they state it connects to XLR. It has a sensitivity switch. It's adjustable from plus 4 dBu or minus 10 dBV. Goodness, it's tough to say. Which basically just means, if you're listening to pro or consumer output, then you can switch it to whatever sensitivity makes the most sense for you. It does have built-in amplification. And let's see, is there anything else here worth noting? There are some toggle adjustments on the back. So let's take a look at a couple pictures here. Now, this is just set up in my living room. And then the top, it's got that, I guess it's a rosewood type finish. And my kid and my wife both thought this was an ugly speaker. From the front of it, I can't really disagree. And my buddy Michael, Youthman on YouTube, says that this reminds him of Wally, which, once you see it, you can't unsee it. You got 2 slotted ports to each side, And then we go and look at the back and we see the contours. So on the contours, you have plus or minus 3 dB for high frequency. You have plus or minus 6 dB for low frequency. And I'll show you what those do a little bit later. And then this is just a more straight on photograph of the speaker. Power on and off switch and XLR balanced inputs. This was measured using my Klippel near field scanner. It is a state-of-the-art measurement device which allows you to measure a speaker in an anechoic fashion, but non-anechoically. Or should I say, it allows you to measure non-anechoically, but get anechoic data. If you're curious about how this works, some of the science behind it, some of the tech, you can watch my interview with one of the designers, Christian Bellman from Klippel. He is a very intelligent young man. I say young, I'm 38. He's probably what, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years younger than me, but makes me feel old when I say somebody else is a young man. Keep going. A picture of the setup in my garage. So this is the Klippel near field scanner, and then this is the speaker laid onto the stand for the Klippel near field scanner. And you can see I have it in the horizontal configuration. Now you can turn the speaker upright, and they actually do say that you can do that in the manual. But for testing purposes, I tested it the way that I know most people are probably going to use it, because when I did a Google search, I don't think I found but maybe 1 or 2 pictures of people that were using the speaker standing up. Nearly every video or picture I saw, especially for studios, they had these speakers laying down horizontally like this. So here we go. Now the speaker was measured at the tweeter axis, and this is some notes from the manufacturer where they say between 1 and 3 meters listening distance. And they do say that the tweeter is the primary axis. So they say tweeter height is at from the floor, listener's ears. So that's how I measured it. And then I kind of give you some notes. I'm just telling you, hey, this is how I measured the speaker. And then this was in the right configuration, which means that, again, this speaker is the mid-range and this speaker on the right side is the mid-bass. So when you're looking at the data, keep that in mind. Going clockwise is the negative response side, and that is the speaker's mid-range. So we're going to keep going down here. And here's some notes on the CTA 2034 specification, which is a means of providing you accurate data that all manufacturers should be able to provide. And then it gives you a way to compare apples to apples because it is a standardized method of test. If you're curious about what each one of the lines in the graphic below relates to, you can hit this little drop down, and this will tell you what the definition for each one of these curves below is. And I'm going to get rid of that. So starting off, the on-axis response is the black line. And one thing I do want to note real fast up front is this blip down here where you have a spike at around 25 hertz or so. That is a measurement error. That's just an artifact of the room because the roll-off of this speaker is so steep relative to the internal noise of the room itself. That creates a signal-to-noise ratio issue. Where the noise overrides the actual output signal from the speaker. So it's not a big deal because anybody who's looking at this data can just draw an imaginary line in their head from here to here, and there you go. But I do want to note that this is not inherent to the speaker itself, so this is just a measurement anomaly. Okay, so the on-axis in black, we can see that on the low frequency end, the response starts to roll out just below 50 hertz or so, and when it starts rolling off, it rolls off quickly. Going on, we see it's pretty smooth. I mean, you're averaging about, I'm going to say 90 dB in this image here. And worth noting that this is an active speaker, so it's not a sensitivity per se. It's just I was feeding an input, and this is the SPL that came out of it. But for the purpose of this graph, we're just going to say on average, we're just drawing a line at about 90 dB. And deviations from that occur at around the, 400, 500 hertz region, about a 1 dB or so deviation there. Another one around the 800-900 hertz region. But the main one that I noticed is this strong dip on axis in the 2 kilohertz region. And this actually seems like it's born from the steep roll off of the mid-range, which we'll show in the near field data below. But for right now, we're going to kind of keep going. And then you can kind of see another dip here on axis, but smooths out off axis. We can see that in the listening window, the dashed green line. Keep going, and we see some other things kind of going on, and then a roll off above about, what is that, maybe, I don't know, 13, 14K or so. So let's go back and look at the listening window. Now, the listening window is basically a spatial average of plus or minus 30 degrees from the horizontal axis, so going this way, and then plus or minus 10 degrees up and down from the speaker. And ideally, you want the listening window to follow the trend of the on-axis response. You don't expect it to will be the same, but if it follows the trend, that usually means that the on-axis and off-axis behavior within a listening window that's typically nominal of most listeners and or their friends who are sitting nearby will hear. And if we're looking at that, we can see, yeah, the on-axis trends with the listening window, and except for this strong dip right here. So this leads me to believe that this is just simply an on-axis occurrence at the, what is this frequency? About 6 kilohertz or so, 5 kilohertz. But yeah, overall, it trends pretty well. Again, the thing that concerns me is this dip around the 2 to 3 kilohertz region. Now, if we go to early reflections, which is mostly the frontal hemisphere and then basically just right behind the speaker, we see a dip, again, a strong dip around 2 to 3 kilohertz, and then it rebounds, catches up. So these are directivity errors, and these are issues in the crossover region. And we can tell that if we go down here and look at the directivity indices measurements. Generally, what I like to do for these is just draw an imaginary line in my head to look at the trend in the mid-range, continue it on up, and any deviation from that is a deviation in the directivity itself. Now, worth noting is the sound power directivity index, which is this red line right here. It is everything, 360 degrees above and below the speaker. So you're typically going to expect to see some deviation in the high frequency because most speakers don't have speakers, or especially high frequency drive units, on the back of them. So they're basically radiating only in the front hemisphere. So instead, what I like to do is I like to look at the early reflections directivity index, which is this blue line. Same kind of thing there. What I'm looking at is a general trend through the mid-range. Looks pretty good. And then when you get up into this 2 kilohertz region, you can see that the trend changes. So what this means is that the speaker is becoming more directive as it's going up in frequency, which you expect. That's because the speaker is beaming, or the drive unit itself is beaming. And then when you get to the 2-3 kilohertz region, that's where the tweeter starts to take over and the mid-range is allowed to fall off in response. And so what we see here is the speaker's directivity becomes more omnidirectional, and then it becomes more directional again, because as you go to mate one drive unit to another one, typically you're doing that when the one drive unit is starting to become more directional and the other one that you're mating to, like a tweeter in this example, is omnidirectional because it's low in frequency relative to its size. Okay. And if you have any questions about what I'm saying, feel free to ask. I do plan to make a video that explains a little bit more of this in detail, but for now, we're going to keep going. This is the early reflections breakout. So these are the floor bounce, ceiling bounce, front wall bounce, side wall bounce, rear wall bounce, and then that gives you the total, which is in the green. If you want to see what constitutes each of the individual bounces, you can look at this drop down right here, and this shows you. And generally what you're going to pay attention to are the side walls and the ceiling and floor. The ceiling and floor are usually the ones that cause you the most issues, and that's what we're seeing here. So the ceiling is in this dashed red line, so we're seeing a ceiling bounce. And then let's see, where's the floor bounce? This blue. So yeah, but actually all of these are showing that kind of issue. And then I want to look at the sidewall bounce. So yeah, the sidewall bounce is still the same thing. Again, it seems like there's an improper crossover between the tweeter and the mid-range. But, going back up and looking at the mid-bass to mid-range, there's no directivity errors there. So the crossover at the mid-bass and mid-range region in the low frequency is good. So no issues there. It's just in that tweeter to mid-range that's really causing issues here. Estimated in-room response. Now, this is based on a typical room, and this one is kind of an outlier, meaning that because this is a near-field speaker, I don't necessarily expect the estimated in-room response, which is taken with all of the different room reflections into account, to come into play as much as you do with a standard speaker where you're listening, 4 meters away or something like that. So this is just here for, your own edification, if you will. But I wouldn't hinge a lot on this, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Now, this is the horizontal SPL from plus or minus 90 degrees to 0 degrees on axis to the sides of the speaker. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. I mean, it's just a lot to unpack. But if you pay attention to this graphic, what you'll notice is that if you go to the negative side, which is the dashed lines, you'll see that the response changes more in the tweeter to mid-range area and maybe the above 1K or so. But if you go to the positive side, which is more toward the mid-bass, you'll notice that the changes occur lower in frequency. And that's because you're having more separation between the mid-range and the mid-bass, and that creates off-axis lobing effects. And it's really interesting to see in a speaker like this, because typically you see a symmetrical speaker where, you know, you just have like a tower speaker and you basically cut it in half, and you expect that it's going to sound the same from this side of the speaker to this side of the speaker. You know, no matter what side you're on, it's going to sound the same. But in a case like this speaker where, you know, one drive unit is playing up to, you know, 1 or 2 kilohertz and the other one is only playing up to 150 hertz or something like that, then as you go from one side to the other, things change, you know, and you can definitely tell that difference in the pattern radiation. So it's interesting to see something like this, you know, objectified, if you will. And then we look at the vertical frequency response, 0 degrees plus or minus 40 degrees. And this actually looks pretty good. I mean, within 30 degrees, you're within what, 3 dB? No, man, you're actually way better than that. You're within a couple dB, because again, this 2 kilohertz drop right here is troublesome. And then when you go plus or minus 40 degrees, you know, the response mostly stays the same until you get above this 2 kilohertz region, and then they start to diverge. But nobody's going to listen to the speaker sitting 40 degrees above or below. Most people are going to be dead on axis with it. But what this data is telling you is that, you know, if it doesn't aim directly toward you, then that's okay. As long as you're within, you know, a couple degrees, you're more than okay. Now we're going to look at the horizontal contour plot. So this is the same thing as this data, the horizontal SPL data, just taken and rolled up into some angular sections. And the takeaway here that I'll point out is, again, notice that I'm saying the mid-range is on the left of the speaker, so it's all going this way. So the mid-range is on this side of the speaker, and this 0 dark degree line right here would be the tweeter, and then going this way up would be toward the mid-bass. And what you'll notice is that there is more mid-range energy on this side of the speaker, on the left side of the speaker, than there is on the right side of the speaker. So that's interesting, and that's the same thing we saw above, but again, it's just a different way to see it. You can see some directivity mismatches here, probably some kind of resonances going on. I'm not 100% sure, but just the fact that there is a dip here, you know, leads me to believe there's some issues going on. Now, this could just be comb filtering, but it's at such a low angle that I'm not sure if comb filtering will be coming into play here, and it very well could be. It could also be, you know, the ports themselves. I'm not sure at this moment, but it's interesting to note. Then when you go up higher in frequency, again, you're seeing this 2 kilohertz suck out between the mid-range and the tweeter, which isn't anything new. But what's really interesting is that when you get above that into the 3 to 4 kilohertz region, look how fast that radiation pattern jumps back out. So basically what we're seeing is the speaker is omnidirectional below about 200 hertz or so, you know, give or take. And that's represented by this red line here. And as you go up in frequency, you go from omnidirectional to plus or minus 90 degrees, like that, right? And then it starts creeping up, but then all of a sudden you get up to here and it just, boom, you're at plus or minus 10 degrees or plus or minus 20 degrees, and the horizontal axis is where that sweet spot is according to this data. So what this basically saying is aim the speaker on axis, and if you have to move it, you know, position it side to side, I wouldn't go any more than 10 degrees, because you're definitely going to notice this. And I noticed this even when the speaker was aimed right at me. Then going above 2 kilohertz, we can see that around 3 kilohertz, you go really wide again, from about, you know, maybe 20, 30 degrees to about 60, 70 degrees. And that's crazy. I mean, that's just really, really interesting to me. And then you get narrow again. So this speaker has a lot of radiation shifts. And I would honestly say that, you know, just based on this data set right here, if I saw this and somebody told me this was going to be a loudspeaker in a room, I would probably say it's not something that I would recommend buying. But again, since this is a near field speaker and the room has much less of a role here, unless you have like a really, really small room, then this stuff isn't as consequential as it normally is with a standard loudspeaker that's put far away from you, you know, out into a room. And then this is the same thing as above, normalize. You can go check this out later if you want to. And then this is the vertical contour plot. So again, you would take the same thing away from this as you did the vertical SPL graphic that I showed you above with the lines, but now it's just laid out into a rectangle. And we can see that below 200 hertz, you're pretty much omnidirectional, 150 hertz, 200 hertz. Going up, you can see that there is a peak here in output at about, 1.5, 1.6 kilohertz. But again, it's the same story. This strong dip between the mid-range and the tweeter. And then below the tweeter axis, you have a more wide range of, of tolerance as far as positioning. And I don't know. Again, it's just one of those things. Stay at the tweeter level. Don't go anywhere else. Not the greatest directivity here, but you're listening near field. So how much do these things matter in the overall scheme of things? I don't know. I don't have enough experience with listening to multiple near field monitors with varying degrees of what I would consider accuracy in regards to radiation pattern or directivity control. So I can't tell you. I can just say that I didn't notice anything major in my listening that I can tell you was directly attributed to directivity. I do have questions about some things though, but we'll see. And then this is a globe plot. This is the SPL data just taken and put into a more intuitive way of looking at it. So 0 degrees is the on axis, 180 is behind the speaker, plus or minus 90 degrees to the side, and you are looking down, bird's eye view, at the radiation pattern of the speaker, starting at 200 hertz, going to 20 kilohertz. And what we can see again is if you go to the left of the speaker, you have more mid-range information than if you go to the right of the speaker, because this is where the mid bass is, and you do have some kind of issue around this. What is that frequency? 800 hertz? I can't follow this sign. I think it's about 800 hertz. Keep going. Vertical. So this is looking at the side of the speaker. 0 degrees is out in the front, above the speaker, below the speaker, behind the speaker. Follow this legend over here. And the same thing we saw before, stay within plus or minus 30 degrees is really well controlled. But if you're going to listen to this near field, you're probably going to listen to it on axis anyway. So just stick with 0. Harmonic distortion. And this is an area that I thought this speaker did really good at. When sweeping the speaker and listening to it at loud levels of music, I never noticed any kind of issues with it. The harmonic distortion at 86 dB looks really, really good. At 96 dB, it still looks quite good. And then at 101 dB, it's actually still well controlled. I mean, the only real issues that I'm seeing are just lower frequency issues. Now, yeah, at 101 dB, you're getting above 1% THD and you're getting close to 3%. But 101 dB and you still haven't exceeded 3% THD, I consider that good for the size of the speaker and the fact that, the mid-range only has one speaker in it. So that's pretty good. I don't know if it's the best I've ever seen, but I think it's pretty good. Now, this is the near field measurements. And the one thing I wanted to note here was this steep roll-off of this mid-range unit and then the roll-off of the tweeter. Now, the levels look a little bit messed up. I realize that, but you got to remember that you're basically adding these two speakers together. Something funky is going on here as far as not the measurements, but what happened to the measurements, like what the results are showing you. And I'm curious kind of why is there such a gap in the tweeter crossover? Could they not push this a little bit lower? Or why do they feel a need to cross the mid-range so steep? I mean, does it have breakup issues? It's a 6.5 inch. So I'm sure it does, but I wouldn't guess it would until, you get up closer to, 4 or 5K. But I don't know. I'm not the designer. I'm just questioning why that choice was made. I would be curious to know. And then you can see the port comes into play below, what is that, about 80, 70 hertz or so, So anyway. Response linearity. So this is me taking the speaker, measuring it at 76 dB at 1 meter, and then measuring at 86, 96, and then 102 dB at 1 meter, comparing those three to the 76 dB to see how much the SPL is changed. And what I mean is if you increase the sound 10 dB, then you expect the sound to increase uniformly across all the frequencies 10 dB. But that doesn't often happen. Typically what you have is compression, like thermal issues. You can have amplifier limiting, if it's got a built-in amplifier. Then you can have issues with enhancement, distortion issues that would provide you additional SPL, which you wouldn't want. I mean, you think, hey, it's free SPL, but you don't want SPL as a byproduct of distortion. That's not a good thing. So this is what we've got here. So in red, we're going to start off with the red one. This is 86 dB versus 76 dB. And what this should be is a flat line. All these should be flat lines because there should be no change, but this is a real speaker and it has real problems. But looking at 86 dB, there's not a lot. I mean, it's about a quarter of a dB output change, compression mostly, and then some compression on low end, a little bit of enhancement around 50, 60 hertz. But then if we go up to 102 dB, we can see that that's when things really start to change. Is high frequency above 4 kilohertz, you're trending more toward 1 dB total. And then on the low end, you're trending about maybe 1.25 dB, 40 hertz. And then you've got this, and we're going to keep going. Now, this is a measurement in my room compared to the predicted in-room response. If you want to read about that, you can. But basically what we're seeing here is that the measurements were taken at 1.5 meters in blue and then 2.5 meters in this purple, overlaid against the estimated in-room response from the anechoic data. And they kind of follow, the estimated in-room response, but they don't hit it exactly. And I think that's okay in this case because this is a near-field measurement. The estimated in-room response is expecting this room or this speaker to be out into a room, have typical room reflection, things like that. And this speaker is not showing that, or this measurement, I should say, is not showing that because the measurement is taken relatively close to the speaker. So it's not getting a lot of room effects. It's out, at the center of the room. The one thing I do want to note, however, when I measured closer, you can actually see that there's more high frequency content than there is when I measured just a little bit further away. So the difference is about 2 dB, and that's in about 1 meter. And I noticed that when I was listening to the speaker that it sounded a bit bright. It actually sounded sibilant, and I thought, man, what's going on? And I'm wondering if that's what it is. And so I actually moved further back into the room, but I wasn't trying to take note mentally about the high frequency content. I was really mainly focused on the mid-range mid-bass to see what changed when I moved out into the room. So I can't really tell you that if you move 4 meters away, that'll be okay. But again, this is a near-field speaker. You're going to be listening to this near field. So you may want to consider that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Tone controls. So this is what we talked about earlier with the plus or minus 3 dB high frequency, the plus minus 6 dB low frequency tone controls. And I was curious to see what they did. Like what frequency are those effective? I didn't know if it was a standard tone control or not. And it looks like it is. And when I say standard tone control, most tone controls hinge around 1 kilohertz. So low frequency adjustments are going to be 1 kilohertz and below. High frequency is going to be 1 kilohertz and above. And that's what we're seeing. So we're just seeing plus 3 dB high frequency, minus 3 dB high frequency, and then plus minus 6 dB on the low end. But the low end, that's got some room effects, so I made sure to note that below 50 hertz, it's questionable. Maybe even down to 60 hertz, this result is questionable. But it's really just for your own information to see where the tone controls pick up in frequency. And then this is my parting random thoughts. So let me snap back out to this. And I'm actually just going to kind of read some of my notes here to you guys and walk through this. Now, if you want to go to my website, I've got a Spotify playlist link where I provide you with all the different songs that I listen to. There's all sorts of different music on there. I'm not heavy into classical music like your typical audiophile, so you'll have to forgive me for not listening to Bach or Beethoven or whatever. That's just not my gig. Subjective listening was done at about 1.5 meters from the speaker primarily. I did go out to about 3 meters, and I actually went almost as far as 4 meters to try, see what the sound was like at varying distances. And like I said before, I noticed the closer I was to the speaker, the more aggravating, I guess, the high frequency content was. And at about 1.5 meters is ultimately where I landed as far as my main listening position, because I wanted to be in that sweet spot between 1 and 3 meters, like Focal recommends in their manual. I did not try listening at different off-axis angles horizontally or vertically. I mean, these are studio monitors. I'm expecting most people are going to position them the way Focal tells you to, and you're not going to sit to the side of them. You're going to aim them on axis, so I didn't listen off axis. I did listen both in the horizontal configuration with them laying flat like they are right now, and also vertically mounted. Now, this is a weird thing, okay? So when I'm listening to these, I noticed that when music was panned left or right, or when I was listening in mono, that I could point out the mid-bass speaker every time with lower male vocals, it seemed like, and it drove me insane. I don't know if it's because I knew what size that mid-bass was on, or what side that mid-bass speaker was on, but I just continually noticed it, and it drove me nuts. So I turned the speaker standing upright, and I didn't notice it as much anymore. It actually felt like the music all came more from the tweeter axis. So I don't know. That's food for thought. If you guys want to play around with that, if you have these, you can let me know if you've noticed that. Maybe it's just a psychoacoustic thing. Who knows? But I thought I would note it. Oh, I noted that these were soft in the 2 to 3 kilohertz region when I was listening to music. And I always listen to music before I measure because I don't want my measurements to influence my subjective analysis of the speakers. So I'll always listen before I measure every time. And when I was listening, I noticed that, certain sounds didn't have like the right bite or didn't have the right attack of response that I was expecting or that I'm used to hearing in other speakers. And it just didn't sound right. And I actually wrote the word soft in my notes. And when I went back and looked at my measurements, I saw that there was a dip in that 2 to 3 kilohertz region. And I thought maybe that's what I'm hearing. You could try actually EQing that up if you have a good parametric EQ. You can just put one band in there and bring that up and see if that helps. I probably should have just to be 100%, but I just didn't. And I didn't think about it until just now. Let's see what else we got here. I said nice controlled bass and higher love, great bass and know your enemy. Yeah, I think the majority of my notes here, I'll just go ahead and get to the point. The mid-range and the mid-bass on this speaker is impeccable. I mean, I don't know if it's because I was listening to near field and didn't have the effect of the room. I will say I did sit out further away from the speaker, close to about the 4-meter range at one point, just to see if that changed. And yeah, the mid-bass changed, of course, but the mid-range and the mid-bass was just great. And if you look at the measurements, you can see why. I mean, they're almost dead flat on axis, and that's where I was listening, was on axis. The only thing that I noticed as far as the mid-range was there was an issue, I guess, and when I was listening to Lauryn Hill's Doo-Wop, that thing, in parentheses, where that song's very heavy. I don't know how to put it, very complex. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of low frequency content, mid-range content at the exact same time. So when I hear issues, normally I chalk that up to IMD with that particular track. I didn't do IMD testing on the speaker, and I haven't done any for a little while, and maybe I'll try to get back to that soon. But I'm going to guess there's some IMD effects going on there, but I don't know for sure that's what it was. But that particular track was the only one I noticed it on, and it was at higher output levels than I think most people are going to be listening to. I mean, if you're mixing, you're probably listening to about 85 dB on average, so you're probably not listening to 95 dB plus. But that's just something worth noting. Free Fallin' by John Mayer, his live version of Tom Petty's song was great. I listened to Maroon 5's What Lovers Do, and I noted that the effects in the soundstage are all on the same Z-axis plane, but behind the speaker. So what I mean is sometimes you listen to a speaker and it kind of horseshoes. In car audio, we call that horseshoeing, where the sound at the speakers sounds like it's closer to you than at the center between the two speakers. And it kind of horseshoes around. So that's why we call it horseshoeing, right? And in home audio, you kind of get the same effect with a lot of speakers too. But in this particular case, I didn't notice that. I felt like the soundstage depth started at the same point across the soundstage, meaning from left to right, everything was equal on the same plane instead of horseshoeing back where the center felt deeper than the sides of the soundstage. So that was kind of good. Kind of cool, I guess I should say. Volume. So these speakers, like I said, they don't have a lot of distortion that I noticed. I was listening to them at about 95 dB for a bit, and it didn't sound like I was listening to them that loud. I actually took out my SPL meter and checked, and I realized, oh crap, I'm listening to these at 95 dB. Like, that's not good for long-term listening. So be careful, because they don't really give you any hint. There's no like audible distortion. I've listened to rap, rock, everything, and there was no popping going on, no vent chuffing or anything like that. That normally says, hey dude, you need to turn me down. They didn't have that. And while it's great, it's also a bad thing at the same time, because you can wind up listening to music too loud for too long if you're not careful. So keep that in mind. I did note when listening in mono, I could easily tell the mid-range mid-woofer split. Not so much with stereo unless it was panned. I mentioned that before. I noted that the soundstage is about 2 feet outside of the speakers and about 2 feet deep in the center. So not a huge soundstage. And I don't know if that's an artifact of listening to near field. It may be. I'm just not sure. Again, I don't normally listen near field. So you're kind of learning with me in this case. There is zero mechanical noise. Already said that. The on-axis response is really quite linear, as I mentioned before, with the exception of that 2 to 3 kilohertz on-axis dip, and it's very strong off-axis as well. So just kind of keep that in mind. One thing a lot of people ask about with power speakers is hiss. And hiss is just that, it sounds like low-level static. When I had this speaker switched to the plus 4 dBu, there was no audible hiss at 1.5 meters, and even putting my ear right up next to the speaker, I could barely hear hiss. When I switched the sensitivity to the negative 10 dBV, I noticed the hiss was more audible, but still not from the 1.5 meters away. So to wrap everything up, I think my takeaways here are great mid-range, great mid-bass. I mean, just great. I don't want to say best ever, but it is really, really good. Above 1K is where things start to kind of change for me. So the 2 to 3 kilohertz dip made things sound, soft, not as aggressive as I thought they should have based on my experience with other music and, reference setups and things like that. And then I could have swore that I heard sibilance out of these speakers, but the measurements didn't exactly show that, but they do show a tilt in the upper frequency response. So I'm wondering if maybe I was hearing that. It was just enough to carry it with certain music and maybe think that it was sibilance. I'm not sure. If I had 2 bands of EQ, I think I could take this speaker from what I would consider a great speaker to, what I would consider a benchmark speaker. And, I noted the 2 bands of EQ in my review. I think around the 2-3 kilohertz region, just a simple graphic EQ or a parametric EQ right there to bring it up about 3 dB or so. And then the high frequency, if I could shelve that down maybe a little bit, or even just take like a wide Q at 10K and maybe bring that down a little bit, I think it would go, from great to incredible. So while this speaker isn't necessarily perfect, in my opinion, I do think that it is certainly one worth considering, especially for those of you who are listening to near-field studio monitors. Buy them from somewhere where you can get a good return policy. You can test them out in your own setup and then send them back if you don't want to. And I threw an Amazon affiliate link down here. You can get it from Sweetwater, B&H, Amazon, all sorts of other places. But if you want to get it through Amazon, you can do that through my affiliate link. That gets me like 4% commission at no additional cost to you. And it provides me a way to kind of keep paying for server space and all the equipment that I've got to buy and all that kind of stuff to keep doing this kind of thing. So anyway, with that said, I'm out. I hope you guys appreciate it. If you don't mind, hit the subscribe button if you already haven't. Give this thing a thumbs up if you liked it. If you didn't, I'm sure you're going to give it a thumbs down anyway, but that still helps me out, so that's cool too. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And hopefully I've done this studio monitor review some service here. Studio monitors are a different animal in regards to how they're intended to be listened to than loudspeakers. So hopefully I did a good job of kind of tracking that pretty well and relaying that information to you guys. But that's it. I hope you guys have a good one. Take care. Peace.